Cool. This is my topic, integrated or segregated in Ontario, which is kind of exploring South Asian settlers and the heterogeneity within the context of specific immigrant urban spatialities. Uh, when I look at this context, I'm basically first, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. With gratitude, my husband Sharad and I, Shruti, first generation immigrant Indian settlers, and our child Swara, we've built a home on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee peoples in the William Treaties and Treaty 13 area, which is colonized as Aurora, Ontario. There exists a long history of First Nations and Métis people in Ontario that commands immense respect. For more information, you can actually go to Native Land Map on Google and look at where we all are at on the Turtle Land. This is the agenda. I'll first try to introduce the paper, which is basically a course paper arising out of a seminar course that I took last year at York. I look at my positionality, which has informed my theoretical framework, methods, and then I move on to key learnings, finally some future trajectories, and the conclusion. Let's look at the thesis and positionality. I have looked at colonized Ontario as the urban context, and I look at some academic discourses on socio-economic diversity around South Asians, in quotes. I also look at differences in spatial experiences of neighborhood, settlement, housing, employment, and health, which are encountered by these groups. When I look at the positionality, I'd like to introduce myself as a feminist researcher. I'm an immigrant Indian woman. And I often feel a sense of discomfort when people address me as South Asian, when academic discourses slot me in South Asian geographical context, because I'm very aware of my privilege as a designer migrant, as an express entry professional who landed in Canada about 4 years back. I'm a permanent resident. I'm an upper caste Hindu woman. I have a middle class background. So my struggles are incomparable to immigrants of other South Asian groups who are refugees, who are economic migrants in blue collar jobs. This kind of reorients me as a model minority, a privileged diasporic group member, and something beyond a victimized immigrant in the racialized spaces, where I need to recognize my complicity within the Canadian nationalist agenda and the ongoing colonial domination. But I would also like to share that this paper was written in the background of some racialized experiences I underwent in a classroom environment. Whether it was my skin color, the stereotype of originating from a country where English is a second language, or just the fact that I'm an immigrant woman from the global South. I used to hardly get any feedback on my content, but largely on the language and communication when I led seminar discussions or submitted written assignments for that particular course. I kind of embodied a normalized notion that newcomer immigrants with ESL have issues with communication, which led me to holding back some specific politics and cultural expression when I was doing the coursework, and also a feeling of isolation. This has informed my theoretical framework of intersectionality, and of course the method, which was critical literature review as mandated by the course. When I look at intersectionality, I typically look at feminist geographers who look at intersectionality as a specialized concept and the implication in immigrant spaces and transnational scholarship. I look at hierarchical structures. I look at power dynamics of gender plus class race, which might travel spatially and in a temporal aspect. Besides gender, intersectional lens can also inform production of space, which I found that you could find that through multiple power formations like whiteness in academic scholarship, for example, in geography, salience of caste in India and amongst Indians, and implicit racism and anti-racialism debates that go around in the so-called multicultural English-speaking Canada. Uh, This paper also looks at heterogeneity in within South Asians, wherein I look at differences in various variables that include age, sexuality, nationality, ability, politics, and religion beyond gender, and some inter and intra-group tensions between nations that contested nations that form South Asia, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. I also look at, uh, I mean, the research also kind of informs an individual's marker of privilege or precarity as part of a diasporic community. One particular aspect that informed my learning through this review was the fact that there was a dominance of Indian nationals in the South Asian diasporas in Canada, especially in academic research projects, their overrepresentation and consequently spilling onto policy decisions. Uh, when I look at the method, I look at, as a course mandated, I was supposed to do a critical research review. I looked at journal publications over the last 20 years. I was asked to look at the Metropolis project, which was a huge effort into immigrant integration into the colonial land of Canada. I was also referred to Canadian cities in transition and Roger Kell's work on suburban planet. In addition, I looked at the journal compendium on South Asian diasporas that kind of nuances diversity among South Asians and the whole problematic construction of South Asia as such. So in terms of the rationale focus on immigrant urban spatialities was the fact that these clusters are identified as key focus areas to promote economic and social integration of immigrants by CD's, the Ontario Metropolis Centre. They're also part of the top 11 challenges facing Canadian cities in the 21st century. So some key learnings were around the following questions: that does heterogeneity in housing and settlement and ethnic enclave kind of benefit all members within, a household or within a community? Aren't there some interesting conjunctures on precarious employment and health? Uh, what do these hybrid identities mean for future trajectories for diasporic research? Let's look at the first one. When you look at heterogeneity in housing and settlement, my first learning was the fact that racial concentration is not always associated with greater neighborhood poverty. Cities often display a dichotomous behavior when it comes to immigrant concentration. So you have high incidence of apartment housing, you have high racial diversity that highlight neighborhood patterning of low income, and there's also this increasing odds of poor immigrant people of color living in the low cost and the least desirable neighborhoods, even social housing in the inner suburbs. However, you also find wealthier members of the same immigrant groups who are able to live in higher status ethnic communities, which are often called ethnic enclaves or ethnoburbs. So despite the thriving nature of these ethnic enclaves, many diasporic researchers on typically on South Asia found that they conjure a kind of negative images of a ghetto, even within the same community. So people don't want to be known as South Asian people living in a particular area, Indians living in a particular area. Spaces of ethnoburbs like Brampton and Albion, Islington, and North York is called as Little India. You have a little Bangladesh. You have a little Pakistan being, termed by South Asian people themselves, because for them it kind of vaguely conjures country-based affiliations and not, homogenized South Asian spaces. And this is despite the possibility that many communities from different countries of the same geographical context may stay in the same area. So when you look at this, are ethnic enclaves beneficial to all members within the same community? So let us look at a couple of examples. I found that the Sikh or the Punjabi community of Mississauga and Brampton often excluded a sense of collective belonging in the ethnic enclaves created by this community. And one of the research papers found that this has actually led to federal and provincial nominations and winning of elections for some Canadian Sikh candidates. Even specifically women, they've been able to leverage social and cultural capital in terms of the religious centers, the sports club, media outlets, to improve their status economically and fight the barrier to political participation, which is generally the norm that the immigrant people of color are not have a lot of barriers to political participation. So much so that 3 out of 5 current members of parliament representing Brampton are professional women of Canadian, Punjabi, or Sikh origin. And they have achieved better economic, social, and political standing while living in these very ethnic enclaves. Uh, Now, in the same community, you also have less researched areas of invisible care work of Sikh Punjabi mothers in these ethnic enclaves who are basically temporary residents or sponsored family members to Canada. Um, I came across a research paper which talked about life story interviews in these ethnoburbs that also highlight how grandmothering work, I quote, remains unacknowledged and unrecognized as most of women's reproductive work does. Very typically, these women had limited access to independent housing, healthcare, paid employment, better access to little access to social networks, and ultimately better human rights. Uh, so when you look at this, I understood that there's the heterogeneity of experiences within a spatial concept of home and neighborhood needs to be considered in ever changing transitions that create new sources of difference, that create new sources of divides within the country's urban centers. They replace the traditional diversities which are based on city size or the location in its heartland, or the periphery, and locating, the typical economic base. The major learning that I want to discuss is the fact that other interesting conjectures on precarious employment and health. So, uh, studies on immigrant women's voices from Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan generated different conversation around precarious employment, despite them possessing university degrees from back home. I found out there were relations to physical and mental health issues with racialized social locations, and which was augmented and differentiated with different religious affiliations, different types of household, and caregiving responsibilities. Another study that kind of detailed ethnic profiling of Indian women, and other study on racial trauma, also resulted in specific, experiences out of the lived realities. Um, in contrast to what generally Canada calls itself as an imagined, inclusive, equitable, and safe space. So these intersectional approaches, I was able to understand multiple connections relating to long-term precarious work conditions of women immigrants, how it negatively affects care work for family, how there are hazardous work environment, how there is a mental health implication, social deprivation, and even commuter issues, to list a few. The above studies offer a fresh perspective against many other studies that I found that had a conflated focus on, other scholarships that kind of looked at South Asians as a catch-all term and said that there are debates surrounding self-reliant South Asians who are model minorities, and those that don't look at the model minority. Also assuming mutual exclusivity among different South Asian groups or people from South Asia. So what do these hybrid identities mean for future trajectories? Research on hybrid immigrant identities can enable academic debates that kind of reject the stereotypical image of a South Asian woman who is a victim of patriarchy. And there are also people who uphold their agency and negotiate the patriarchal cultural practices. And as such, this a research in South Asia or anyone with links to Asia Pacific has been an interest to Canadian geographers because they contribute to over 50% of Canada's immigration, and they also influence Canada's largest urban centers. So, in conclusion, I understand that it is important to problemize definitions of mapping globe as an unchanging set of cultural regions. Um, in terms of transnationalism and mass movements of population. It is also important to conceptualize diasporas as hybrid spatial assumptions rather than having a common geographical axis. Also assuming national identity and culture kind of subsumes inherent differences between intra and intergroup identities that go beyond Indian, South Asian, or Asian, and further sidelines the marginalized diasporic communities. This also further conflicts and juxtaposes issues of immigrant settlers against native indigenous communities, wherein it kind of reduces possibilities of solidarity and understanding shared struggles. I try to draw attention to the academic work that moves away from South Asia and highlights immigrant women's intersectional experiences of marginality or privilege. I also argue that you can delve deeper into each urban speciality to unearth more nuanced experiences of the racialized groups and evolve specific strategies to address them. My research, in the end, I would just like to say that my research is not an isolated process, and it has been informed by safe, gainful conversations with my peer mentor group that came out of a course on Asian studies, critical perspectives. We call ourselves the writing group for now. So thank you, Arpita, Chan, Cindy, Harshita, Ming, Rohina, and Zara for always egging me on. Thank you very much.